They were marching her down the aisle, her face burning with humiliation, until the pilot stepped out of the cockpit, phone in hand, and said 4 words that stopped everyone cold. But let's go back to where this all began, just 30 minutes earlier, when Flight 2847 from Dallas to San Diego was nothing more than another Tuesday afternoon departure, another routine journey for the 163 souls aboard. The Boeing 737 sat on the tarmac at Dallas-Fort Worth International, its engines quiet, its cabin filled with that particular brand of controlled chaos that happens in the minutes before takeoff. Overhead bins slammed shut with metallic thuds. Passengers wrestled carry-on bags into impossible spaces. A mother in row 12 tried to soothe a fussy toddler, while a businessman in first class typed furiously on his laptop, racing against the moment when electronic devices would have to be stowed. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, checking seatbelts, demonstrating oxygen masks that nobody watched, going through motions they'd performed 10,000 times before. In seat 23C, Sarah Mitchell sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing in particular. She was 42 years old, though the lines around her eyes suggested someone who'd lived harder than her years. Her sandy blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans, sneakers, and a plain grey sweatshirt that had seen better days. A small backpack rested at her feet, stuffed under the seat in front of her, according to regulations. She'd already fastened her seatbelt without being asked, already turned off her phone, already done everything by the book, because that's what you did when you understood the importance of following procedures. She looked like 1,000 other passengers, unremarkable, quiet, someone you'd forget the moment you looked away. She'd been trying to make herself invisible, actually, trying to take up as little space as possible, to blend into the fabric seats and recycled air and go unnoticed from Dallas to San Diego. She had somewhere she needed to be, something she needed to do, and all she wanted was to get there without incident. The flight was only 2.5 hours. She could manage 2.5 hours. She'd managed far worse. The man in 23D had arrived late, huffing and annoyed, shoving his oversized roller bag into the overhead bin with unnecessary force. He was in his 50s, wearing khakis and a polo shirt with some corporate logo embroidered on the chest, the uniform of middle management on a business trip. He'd barely glanced at Sarah as he squeezed past her to reach his seat, emanating that particular energy of someone who flew often and resented every minute of it. He smelled like coffee and cologne, too much of both. He'd immediately pulled out his phone, jabbing at it with thick fingers, sighing dramatically when he couldn't get a signal. For a few minutes, there was peace. The flight attendants finished their safety demonstration. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard, announcing their flight time, promising smooth skies and an on-time arrival. The aircraft door was still open, the jet bridge still attached, but they were close to pushing back. Sarah allowed herself the smallest measure of relief. Almost there, almost done with this part. That's when the man beside her started looking at her differently. It began with sideways glances, quick assessments, his eyes traveling from her worn sneakers to her plain sweatshirt to her face, then back again. She could feel his attention like heat, could sense the gears turning in his head. She kept her eyes forward, pretending not to notice, a skill she'd perfected over years of not wanting to be seen. He shifted in his seat, angling his body slightly away from her, a small gesture but deliberate. Then he pulled his phone closer to his chest, as if she might be trying to see his screen. She wasn't. She was staring at the seat back in front of her, at the safety card she'd already memorized, without meaning to, wishing he would just leave her alone. "Excuse me," he said suddenly, his voice loud enough that the woman in 23A looked over. "Miss, flight attendant?" A young flight attendant in a crisp navy uniform appeared in the aisle, her professional smile already in place. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" The man leaned toward her, lowering his voice, but not enough that Sarah couldn't hear every word. "I'm sorry, but I'm not comfortable with my seating assignment. I'd like to move to a different row." The flight attendant's smile didn't waver. I understand, sir. Unfortunately, we're completely full today. I don't have any other seats available. You don't understand, the man insisted, his voice taking on an edge. I need to move. I don't feel safe. Those 3 words hung in the air like smoke. Don't feel safe. Sarah's hands tightened in her lap, her knuckles going white. She knew what was coming. She'd seen this movie before, knew how it ended. The flight attendant's expression shifted, professionalism warring with confusion. Sir, I'm not sure I understand. Is there a specific concern? The man gestured vaguely toward Sarah without looking at her directly. I have a bad feeling. She's been acting suspicious. She won't make eye contact. She keeps staring at the exit doors. And that bag, he pointed at Sarah's backpack, she was very protective of it. Wouldn't let it out of her sight in the terminal. I saw her in the gate area. Sarah felt the heat rising in her face, felt the eyes of nearby passengers turning toward her. The woman in 23A was staring now. The businessman across the aisle had stopped typing. She wanted to shrink into her seat, to disappear, but instead she forced herself to speak. That's not true, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. I haven't been acting suspicious. I've been sitting here minding my own business. The man didn't look at her. I'm just saying what I observed. I have a right to feel safe on an aircraft. The flight attendant looked between them, her smile completely gone now. Ma'am, is there anything in your bag that might be concerning? Any prohibited items? No, Sarah said. Just clothes and personal items. You can search it if you want. That's not good enough, the man said, his voice rising. I've been flying for 25 years. I know when something's not right. I'm telling you, I don't feel comfortable sitting next to her. Other passengers were definitely watching now. The controlled chaos of boarding had given way to a different kind of tension, the kind that ripples through a confined space when conflict emerges. The flight attendant's eyes darted toward the front of the cabin, clearly looking for backup. Sir, if you could just lower your voice, she started. I will not lower my voice, the man said. This is a matter of safety. After everything this country has been through, after everything we know about threats, you're going to ignore a passenger's legitimate concerns. That's what you're telling me? Sarah closed her eyes. Here it was. The thing she'd been dreading, the thing she'd hoped to avoid by making herself small and quiet and invisible. The thing that happened when people looked at you and saw only what they'd been taught to fear. A second flight attendant appeared, older, with the bearing of someone senior in the crew. Behind her came a man in a dark suit, gate agent or supervisor, judging by the radio clipped to his belt. The walls were closing in. What seems to be the problem? The supervisor asked, his voice carrying that false calm of someone trained in de-escalation. The man in 23D launched into his complaint again, embellishing it now. Sarah had been nervous in the terminal, he said. She'd been checking her phone repeatedly, looking around as if watching for someone. Her bag was packed strangely. She wouldn't make conversation. She seemed out of place. The evidence he offered was nothing. Observations that could describe half the people in any airport on any given day. But the way he said it made it sound damning. Sarah tried to defend herself, tried to explain that she was just a woman trying to get to San Diego, that there was nothing suspicious about her, that she had every right to be on this flight. But her voice sounded small against his certainty, her truth less compelling than his fear. The supervisor listened to both sides, his face unreadable. Then he made the calculation that countless authority figures had made before him, the calculation that prioritized avoiding confrontation over seeking justice, that chose the path of least resistance over doing what was right. Ma'am, he said, turning to Sarah with what he probably thought was kindness, I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings and come with me. We need to conduct an additional security screening. I already went through security, Sarah said, hearing the desperation creeping into her voice and hating it. I have a boarding pass. My ticket is valid. I haven't done anything wrong. It's just a precaution, the supervisor said. If everything checks out, we'll get you on the next available flight. The next flight isn't until tomorrow morning, Sarah said. I need to be in San Diego today. I have somewhere I need to be. The supervisor's expression didn't change. I understand your frustration, ma'am, but I need you to cooperate. Please gather your things. The alternative was unspoken but clear. Gather your things voluntarily, or we'll call security to remove you by force. Sarah looked around the cabin, at all the faces watching her, at the flight attendants who wouldn't meet her eyes, at the man in 23D who sat with his arms crossed and his chin raised, vindicated. She looked for an ally, for someone who would speak up, who would say this was wrong. A few passengers looked uncomfortable, but no one said anything. No one ever said anything. With shaking hands, Sarah reached under the seat and pulled out her backpack. She unbuckled her seatbelt. The mechanical click sounded impossibly loud. She stood, her legs unsteady, and stepped into the aisle. The supervisor gestured toward the front of the aircraft, and she began the long walk, past rows and rows of strangers, past children and business people and retirees, all watching her leave, all making their own judgments about what kind of person gets removed from a plane. Her face burned. Her eyes stung, but she refused to cry, refused to give them that. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on making it to that open aircraft door where at least she wouldn't be on display anymore. Behind her, she heard the man in 23D say something to the supervisor about appreciating the quick response, about this being why he always flew this airline. The words felt like knives. She was 3 rows from the front, almost to the galley, almost to freedom from this humiliation, when the cockpit door opened. A man stepped out into the galley, and the flight attendants immediately straightened. He wore the 4 stripes of a captain on his shoulders, the crisp white shirt and black tie of command. He was maybe 50 years old, with salt and pepper hair cut military short, a square jaw, and the kind of presence that made people pay attention. He'd clearly heard the commotion, had come out to see what was delaying his departure. His eyes swept the scene, the supervisor escorting a passenger off the aircraft, the flight attendants looking tense, the cabin full of watching faces. Then his eyes landed on Sarah, and something changed in his expression. Just for a second, just a flicker, but she saw it. Recognition? Confusion? She couldn't tell. "Captain Reynolds," the supervisor said, "we're just handling a security situation. We'll have this passenger off in a moment and you can push back." Captain Reynolds didn't respond immediately. His eyes were still on Sarah, specifically on her backpack, which hung from one shoulder. On the front pocket, there was a small patch, faded olive drab against the black fabric, so worn that most people wouldn't even notice it. But he noticed. "What's the nature of the security situation?" he asked, his voice neutral. The supervisor started to explain, passenger complaint, acting suspicious, standard protocols, but Reynolds held up one hand. "I'd like to hear from her," he said, nodding toward Sarah. "Ma'am, what's your name?" Sarah's throat was so tight she could barely speak. "Sarah Mitchell." "Where are you headed today, Ms. Mitchell?" "San Diego." "What takes you there?" She hesitated. This wasn't anyone's business. It was private, personal, something she'd planned to do alone, without witnesses or audience, but something in the captain's eyes made her answer honestly. "I'm going to visit a grave," she said quietly, "at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery." The captain's expression shifted again, and this time she saw it clearly, understanding and then anger, though not directed at her. He looked at the supervisor, at the flight attendants, then back at Sarah. Specifically, he looked at that patch on her backpack again. Then he pulled his phone from his pocket. "Nobody leaves this aircraft," he said. "Not yet." The supervisor blinked. "Captain, we've already made the determination." "I'm making a different determination," Reynolds said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who'd made life-and-death decisions in cockpits and knew his word was final on his aircraft. "Everyone stays exactly where they are. I need to make a phone call." He turned, phone already to his ear, and stepped back toward the cockpit. The supervisor looked confused. The flight attendants looked bewildered, and Sarah stood frozen in the aisle, not knowing whether to be hopeful or terrified. Behind them all, through the aircraft, she could hear the murmur of confused passengers, all wondering the same thing. What was happening? Who was this woman? And why had the pilot's entire demeanor changed the moment he really looked at her? The phone call lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When Captain Reynolds emerged from the cockpit again, his jaw was set, his eyes hard. He walked straight to the supervisor, and when he spoke, everyone in the first 10 rows could hear him. "This woman isn't going anywhere," he said, "except back to her seat, and we need to have a serious conversation about what just happened here." The supervisor's face went from confused to defensive in the space of a heartbeat. He straightened his spine, squared his shoulders, adopted the posture of a man whose authority had just been questioned in front of witnesses. Behind him, the senior flight attendant exchanged a glance with her colleague, both of them clearly uncertain about what was unfolding in the galley of their aircraft. In the cabin, passengers craned their necks, some unbuckling their seatbelts to get a better view, the pretense of minding their own business abandoned entirely. Everyone wanted to see what happened next. "Captain Reynolds," the supervisor said, keeping his voice low but firm, "I appreciate your concern, but this decision has already been made. We have protocols for situations like this. A passenger expressed legitimate safety concerns, and we're required to take those concerns seriously. I'm sure you understand that in today's environment, we can't afford to take chances." Reynolds didn't move, didn't blink. What specifically did this passenger do that violated safety protocols? The supervisor hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. She was observed acting suspiciously in the terminal and on the aircraft. Another passenger felt uncomfortable. That's sufficient grounds for additional screening. "Acting suspiciously how?" Reynolds pressed. "Give me specifics." She was nervous, protective of her bag. Wouldn't make eye contact. The passenger who reported her has extensive flying experience and felt something was off. "So she was nervous," Reynolds said, his voice dangerously calm. "On an airplane, where roughly half of all passengers experience some level of anxiety. That's your evidence." The supervisor's jaw tightened. "Captain, I don't think you understand the full situation. I've been doing this job for 12 years. I know how to assess threats. This passenger fit a profile that requires additional scrutiny." "A profile," Reynolds repeated, and now there was an edge to his voice that made Sarah's breath catch. She stood motionless in the aisle, her backpack still hanging from one shoulder, watching this man she'd never met before defend her to people who'd already made up their minds. "Tell me about this profile. I'm not going to discuss security procedures in front of passengers," the supervisor said. "Now, I've been more than patient, but this woman needs to deplane so we can complete an additional screening. You're already delayed. Let me do my job so you can do yours." Reynolds took one step forward, closing the distance between them. He wasn't physically threatening. His posture remained professional, controlled, but there was something in his presence that made the supervisor take an involuntary step backward. "This is my aircraft," Reynolds said quietly. "On the ground or in the air, what happens here is my responsibility, mine, not yours. And I'm telling you that this woman is not leaving unless she chooses to. Are we clear?" The supervisor's face flushed. "I'll need to call my supervisor. This is highly irregular." "You do that," Reynolds said. "While you're at it, you might want to call your airline's legal department too. Have them start drafting an apology letter." "An apology for what?" Reynolds turned to Sarah, and his expression softened. "Ms. Mitchell, would you mind showing him what's in your backpack? You don't have to, but it might help clarify things." Sarah's hands trembled as she swung the backpack around and unzipped it. Inside was exactly what she'd said. Folded clothes, toiletries, a phone charger. But nestled among the mundane items was a photo in a silver frame, carefully wrapped in a t-shirt for protection. She pulled it out, unwrapped it, and held it up. The photo showed a young man in Marine Corps dress blues, his cover squared precisely on his head, his bearing ramrod straight, his eyes bright with the particular combination of pride and idealism that belonged to someone who'd just completed boot camp. He had Sarah's eyes, her jawline. He couldn't have been more than 19 years old. "That's my son," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lance Corporal James Mitchell. He died 3 years ago in Helmand Province. Tomorrow is his birthday. He would have been 26. I'm going to spend it at his grave because that's the only place I can spend it with him anymore." The galley went silent. Even the passenger chatter from the cabin seemed to fade, as if the whole aircraft was holding its breath. The supervisor stared at the photograph, his face going pale. Reynolds spoke into the silence, his voice gentler now, but no less firm. "The patch on her backpack. It's from the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. Her son's unit. I noticed it the moment I saw her because I flew Marine Air before I flew commercial. I know those patches. I know what they mean. That's why I made the phone call." "Who did you call?" the supervisor asked weakly. "A friend at Camp Pendleton." He pulled up the records in about 90 seconds. Lance Corporal James Mitchell, killed in action August 17, 2022, during a patrol that encountered an IED, Purple Heart recipient. His mother, Sarah Mitchell, is listed as next of kin. Current address, Dallas, Texas. Traveling today to San Diego for the annual remembrance visit she makes on his birthday, all of which I confirmed before I came back out here. Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of all these people. She'd cried enough for one lifetime. Cried enough to fill oceans. And she wasn't going to give them that piece of her, too. The supervisor looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. We didn't know. She didn't mention, why should she have to? Reynolds cut him off. Why should a Gold Star mother have to justify her presence on an aircraft? Why should she have to prove she's not a threat because some passenger decided she looked suspicious? You want to know what suspicious looks like? It looks like a woman carrying grief so heavy, it's amazing she can stand up under the weight of it. It looks like someone trying to hold herself together long enough to make it to San Diego to visit her son's grave. That's what you saw and decided was threatening. The senior flight attendant had tears running down her face now, not bothering to wipe them away. The younger one looked stricken. From the cabin, Sarah could hear the man in 23D saying something defensive, trying to justify himself, but his voice sounded hollow even to him. "Captain Reynolds," the supervisor began, "if we'd known." "That's exactly the problem," Reynolds said. "You didn't know. You didn't ask. You didn't give her the benefit of the doubt. You just assumed. Based on what? The way she looked, the way she acted, the fact that she was quiet and kept to herself and had a backpack she cared about protecting because it contained the last physical pieces of her son's memory." Sarah couldn't stay silent anymore. "I tried to tell them," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I tried to explain that I hadn't done anything wrong. But nobody wanted to hear it. They'd already decided." Reynolds turned to her, and the anger in his eyes transformed into something that looked like sorrow. "I know, and I'm sorry that happened. It shouldn't have. Not to you, not to anyone." The supervisor was already on his radio, speaking in urgent, hushed tones to someone on the other end. Sarah caught fragments. Situation has changed. Made a mistake. Need guidance. But she wasn't really listening. She was watching Captain Reynolds, trying to understand why this stranger had gone to bat for her when no one else had. Why he'd bothered to look close enough to see what others had missed. A gate agent appeared in the aircraft door, breathless from running. The supervisor pulled her aside for a hurried conversation, both of them glancing repeatedly at Sarah. More passengers were unbuckling now, standing in the aisles, trying to see what was happening. The flight attendants attempted to restore order, asking people to return to their seats, but their hearts weren't in it. The moment had taken on a weight that couldn't be contained by normal procedures. Reynolds stepped closer to Sarah, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I'm going to make this right. I promise you that. But I need to know, do you still want to fly on this aircraft? After what happened, I would understand completely if you didn't. If you want to take a different flight, I'll personally make sure you get a full refund and compensation. No questions asked." Sarah looked past him, down the length of the cabin to where passengers stared back at her. She saw the man in 23D, still in his seat, but looking decidedly less confident now. She saw the faces of strangers who'd watched her humiliation and done nothing. She saw the flight attendants who'd escorted her down the aisle like a criminal. And she felt something shift inside her chest, something that felt a lot like anger, which felt a lot better than shame. "I want to fly," she said clearly. "I paid for my ticket. I have somewhere I need to be. I'm not the one who should have to leave." Something that might have been respect flickered across Reynolds's face. "All right then, give me a few more minutes to sort this out. You can wait here or in the jetway if you prefer." "I'll wait here," Sarah said. She'd spent 3 years making herself small, trying to disappear into the background of life, because existing in the foreground hurt too much. But standing here now, watching this pilot fight for her, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, like maybe she had a right to take up space in the world. The supervisor finished his conversation with the gate agent and approached Reynolds again. His entire demeanor changed. "Captain, we'd like to apologize for this incident. It's clear there was a misunderstanding. We're prepared to offer Ms. Mitchell an upgrade to first class, a full refund of her ticket, and a travel voucher as compensation." "That's a start," Reynolds said. "What about the passenger who made the complaint?" The supervisor shifted uncomfortably. "We'll have a conversation with him about appropriate use of security concerns." "A conversation?" Reynolds repeated flatly. He used safety protocols as a weapon to remove a woman from an aircraft because he didn't like the way she looked. He caused a Gold Star mother to be publicly humiliated. "And you're going to have a conversation?" "Captain, I can't discuss the specifics of passenger discipline with you." "Then let me make a suggestion," Reynolds said, his voice hard again. "That passenger can take a different flight. Because if he stays on mine, I'm going to make an announcement explaining to everyone exactly what happened here and why, every single detail. Let him sit in that discomfort for 2.5 hours while the people around him understand what he did. Your choice." The supervisor opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "I'll speak with him." He retreated down the aisle, moving toward row 23. Sarah watched him go, watched him lean down to speak quietly to the man in 23D, watched the man's face go through several shades of red. There was a brief argument, heated whispers, the man gesturing angrily, but the supervisor stood firm, and after a few minutes, the man in 23D grabbed his bag from the overhead bin with enough force that other bags shifted and shouldered his way into the aisle. He tried to walk past Sarah without looking at her, but Reynolds stepped into his path. "You owe this woman an apology," the captain said. The man's face was purple now. "I was trying to keep everyone safe. I did what I thought was right." "No," Reynolds said. "You did what was easy. You saw someone you'd decided didn't belong, and you used security as an excuse to remove her. That's not safety. That's prejudice, and you're not flying on my aircraft." The man sputtered, threatened to call the airline's corporate office, threatened to write letters, threatened legal action. But Reynolds simply stood there, immovable, until the man finally gave up and stormed off the aircraft. The moment he disappeared into the jetway, a few passengers in the cabin began to applaud, then a few more. Then the applause spread through the aircraft like wildfire, passengers standing, clapping, some of them cheering. Sarah felt her face burning again, but this time it wasn't from shame. A man in uniform, army dress blues, Sarah recognized, stood up from his seat in row 7. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying through the cabin, "thank you for your son's service. Thank you for your sacrifice. You deserve better than what happened here. Thank you." Sarah managed to say, her voice breaking on the words. Another passenger stood, then another. An older woman who might have been a grandmother, a young couple with a baby, a teenager in a college sweatshirt. One by one, passengers throughout the cabin rose to their feet, and Sarah realized they were honoring her, honoring James, honoring everything she'd lost and everything she'd survived. Reynolds waited until the applause faded, then raised his voice to address the cabin. "Folks, we're going to be delayed about 15 minutes while we sort out some seating arrangements and complete our passenger manifest. I apologize for the inconvenience, but I think you'll all agree it was time well spent. We'll get you to San Diego as quickly as we can after that." He turned back to Sarah. "The first-class seat is yours if you want it. But I need to ask you one more thing. When I make the PA announcement before we take off, is it all right if I explain what happened? I won't use your name if you don't want me to, but I think these people deserve to understand what they witnessed." Sarah thought about it for a long moment. Thought about James, who'd never hidden from anything, who'd run toward danger when others ran away. Thought about the 3 years she'd spent making herself invisible, as if being seen might somehow hurt more than being forgotten. Thought about the pilot who'd noticed a patch on a backpack and cared enough to make a phone call, to stand up, to fight. "Yes," she said, "tell them. Use my name. Use James's name. Let them know who he was." Reynolds nodded, something that looked like pride in his eyes. "It would be my honor. Now let's get you to San Diego. Your son is waiting." The first-class cabin felt impossibly spacious. Sarah had never sat in first class before. Every flight had been economy, middle seats when that was all available. But now she occupied 2A, a window seat with leather that seemed to wrap around her, and she didn't know what to do with all that room. Patricia, the senior flight attendant, had personally escorted her forward, carrying her backpack like it contained something sacred. She'd settled Sarah into the seat, brought water without being asked, and promised that anything she needed, she only had to press the call button. Jennifer, the younger attendant, had stopped by moments later with her own tearful apology, explaining she had a brother in the Navy and should have known better, should have looked closer, should have stood up sooner. Sarah told them both it was okay. Mistakes happen, but the truth was more complicated. What happened wasn't just a mistake. It was a mirror held up to something ugly, something that happened every day to invisible people who didn't have a pilot willing to make a phone call. The aircraft door closed. The jetway pulled back. Through the window, Sarah watched ground crew loading final luggage, conducting last checks. The engines hummed to life, a sound she felt in her chest. Passengers settled in, fastening seatbelts, queuing up movies, making small adjustments humans make when surrendering control to physics and strangers in a cockpit. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds." His voice filled the cabin, calm and authoritative. "Before we push back, I need to address what happened during boarding. I know many of you witnessed a passenger being removed, and I want you to understand why I intervened." The cabin went silent. Sarah felt her stomach clench. She'd agreed to this, told Reynolds to use her name, but agreeing in theory was different from hearing it happen. "The woman who was being removed is Sarah Mitchell," Reynolds continued. "She's in first class now, and I'm going to tell you why. Ms. Mitchell is a Gold Star mother. 3 years ago, her son, Lance Corporal James Mitchell of the United States Marine Corps, was killed in action in Afghanistan. He was 19 years old. He died serving a country he loved, protecting people he'd never met. Ms. Mitchell is traveling to San Diego to visit his grave at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery because tomorrow is his birthday." Someone gasped behind her. Through the seat gap, Sarah saw Patricia pressing a hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "During boarding," Reynolds said, his voice hardening, "another passenger decided Ms. Mitchell looked suspicious. He demanded she be removed for security reasons. Not because she'd done anything wrong, not because she'd violated any rules, but because he looked at her and made assumptions. And the system designed to keep us safe was used as a weapon against a woman who'd already sacrificed more than most of us can imagine. The silence was profound. Sarah felt dozens of eyes on her, but she kept her gaze fixed out the window, watching ground crew in reflective vests going about their choreographed duties. "I'm a former Marine Corps pilot," Reynolds continued. "I flew Harriers out of bases that men like Lance Corporal Mitchell helped protect. When I saw the unit patch on Miss Mitchell's backpack, I recognized it. 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. They call themselves the Professionals. They earned that name through blood and sacrifice. So I made a phone call to verify what I suspected, and I stopped her removal because it was right. Because she'd earned the right to fly without harassment. Because her son died defending the principles this country claims to stand for." A young man in row 5 stood. He wore jeans and an Army Strong t-shirt. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant First Class David Martinez, 2nd Infantry Division. Thank you for your son's service and your sacrifice, and I'm sorry for what happened." "Thank you," Sarah managed, barely audible. A woman in row 8 stood. "My nephew is in the Marines. He's deployed right now. I can't imagine. I'm so sorry." Then another passenger stood, and another, until half the cabin was on their feet in spontaneous respect. Sarah pressed her fingers against her eyes, trying to hold back tears that insisted on coming anyway. Reynolds let the moment breathe before speaking again. "We're going to take excellent care of Ms. Mitchell on this flight. The passenger who made the complaint has been rebooked. Anyone else who has a problem with her presence is welcome to deplane now. But understand that if you stay, you're flying with an American hero's mother, and she deserves respect." No one moved toward the exits. The passengers who'd stood slowly returned to their seats, but the cabin's atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. "Ms. Mitchell," Reynolds said, his voice softer now, "nobody prepares Gold Star families for what comes after. Nobody trains you for how to survive the unsurvivable. The fact that you're on this aircraft today, making this journey, honoring your son's memory, that takes a different kind of courage than what he showed in combat. I hope you know that." Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, could only feel the weight of those words settling into places that had been empty for 3 years. "All right, folks," Reynolds concluded, returning to his professional tone. "We're pushing back now. Flight time to San Diego is 2 hours and 34 minutes. And remember, pay attention to the people around you. You never know who you're sitting next to, what battles they're fighting, what losses they're carrying. A little kindness costs nothing and means everything." The intercom clicked off. The aircraft lurched as the pushback tug moved them from the gate. Sarah watched through the window as the terminal slid past, as they rolled toward the taxiway, as Dallas fell behind. Patricia appeared beside her seat. "Ms. Mitchell, Captain Reynolds would like to know if you'd be willing to visit the cockpit after we reach cruising altitude. He'd like to speak with you in person." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. The takeoff was smooth. The 737 rolled down the runway, gathering speed, then lifted into the Texas sky. Sarah watched the ground fall away, watched the patchwork of highways and houses shrink to miniature. Somewhere below, the man who'd tried to have her removed was probably complaining about his rights. But up here, climbing through 30,000 feet, Sarah felt something that might have been peace. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Patricia guided Sarah forward, through the galley to the cockpit door. She knocked, a specific pattern, and the door opened. Captain Reynolds looked back from the left seat, his hands steady on the controls. "Come in," he said. "I want you to meet someone." Sarah stepped into the tight space filled with instruments and switches, and the enormous windscreen showing nothing but blue sky. The first officer, a younger man, turned from the right seat and stood, offering his hand. "Ma'am, I'm First Officer Castillo. It's an honor." Reynolds engaged the autopilot and swiveled to face her. "I wanted to talk to you up here, away from everyone else. What I did back there, stopping your removal, making those calls, that wasn't heroism. That was the bare minimum of human decency. You shouldn't have to be grateful." "But I am," Sarah said. "You're the first person who bothered to look." Reynolds shook his head. I saw the patch because I know what to look for. I'm a Marine. Former Marine. We never really stop. When I saw 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines on your pack, I had to know. I had to be sure, because I lost friends in Helmand Province. Good men, better men than me. They didn't get to come home and fly airplanes. So when I see someone carrying that grief, I don't get to look away. Does that make sense? Yes, Sarah whispered. Your son, Reynolds said. Tell me about him, if you want to. Sarah looked out through the cockpit windscreen, at the infinite blue, at the world spread below like a promise. And she told him about James as a little boy, obsessed with Legos and justice, always defending kids who got bullied. About James as a teenager, tall and serious, talking about service and duty. About the day he announced his enlistment, how she wanted to scream no but couldn't, knew he'd been heading toward this his whole life. About boot camp graduation, seeing her baby in dress blues looking like a man. About his deployment, sporadic emails that said nothing important, because everything important was classified. About the last email, 3 days before he died, where he said he loved her and was proud to serve. She told him about the knock on her door at 6 in the morning, about knowing what it meant before she opened it, about the casualty notification officers with rehearsed condolences and folders about death benefits, about the funeral at Fort Rosecrans, watching them fold the flag with such precision, the bugler playing taps, about 3 years of trying to keep living because that's what James would want, but how living felt like betrayal, like forgetting. Reynolds listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He sounds like exactly the kind of Marine we needed, he finally said. The kind who understood that service isn't about glory. It's about standing between the people you love and the things that would hurt them, even when it costs everything. That's exactly who he was, Sarah said. Ms. Mitchell, I don't know if this means anything, but from one Marine to the mother of another, your son's service mattered, his sacrifice mattered, and you matter. You deserved better than what happened today. But I want you to know there are still people who see you, who recognize what you've given, who understand that Gold Star families serve too. Sarah felt tears finally break free. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for your son, Reynolds said quietly, for raising him to be the kind of man who'd run toward danger. That takes a special kind of parent. Through the windscreen, the landscape changed, Texas giving way to New Mexico, terrain becoming more dramatic. They were flying west, toward San Diego, toward Fort Rosecrans, toward the white headstone with James's name. Tomorrow, she would stand beside that grave and sing happy birthday like every year of his life. Tomorrow she would tell him about this flight, about the pilot who stood up for her. But today, right now, in this cockpit 35,000 feet above Earth, Sarah Mitchell felt something she hadn't felt since 2 Marines appeared at her door. She felt seen. She felt valued. She felt like maybe she could survive this after all. You should get back to your seat, Reynolds said gently. We'll be serving lunch soon, but if you need anything at all, let them know. And when we land, take your time deplaning. You've earned the right to move at your own pace. Sarah made her way back through the galley, past curious eyes of passengers who now looked at her with recognition, with respect. She settled back into 2A, into the leather and unexpected comfort. Through the window, America rolled past below, vast and beautiful. The aircraft carried her westward, toward James, toward tomorrow's birthday visit. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself to believe that maybe she could face them. Maybe she was stronger than she thought. Maybe her son had passed on more than just his eyes and jawline. Maybe he'd passed on his courage too. The meal service in first class was nothing like Sarah had imagined it would be. Patricia appeared with a tray that looked like it belonged in a restaurant, not an airplane, a proper plate with actual silverware, a cloth napkin, food arranged with care. Grilled chicken with roasted vegetables, a side salad with real greens instead of iceberg lettuce, a warm roll with butter. Patricia set it down with hands that still trembled slightly, her eyes red-rimmed from crying she'd tried to hide in the galley. "Is there anything else I can get you?" she asked, her voice soft. "Anything at all?" Sarah shook her head. "This is more than enough, thank you." But Patricia didn't leave. She stood there in the aisle, gripping the back of the empty seat across from Sarah, clearly wrestling with something she needed to say. Finally, the words came out in a rush. "I have a son. He's 17. He's been talking about enlisting. Army, he thinks. And I've been so scared, been trying to talk him out of it, been showing him college brochures and job postings and anything else I can think of to change his mind. But watching what happened today, hearing Captain Reynolds talk about your son, seeing you—" She paused, wiping at her eyes. "I realized I've been thinking about it all wrong. If my son decides to serve, that's not something to be scared of. That's something to be proud of. And if the worst happens, if I end up where you are, I hope someone treats me with half the dignity you deserved and didn't get. I'm so sorry we failed you." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "You didn't fail me. The system failed, but you're here now, and that matters." Patricia nodded, squeezed Sarah's shoulder once with gentle pressure, then disappeared back toward the galley. Sarah picked at her food, managing a few bites, despite the knot in her stomach. Around her, the first-class cabin had taken on an unusual quiet. Normally she imagined this section would be full of business travelers on phones and laptops, treating the flight as mobile office space. But today, people seemed subdued, reflective. The elderly couple in row 1 kept glancing back at her with expressions that looked like a mix of respect and sorrow. The businessman across the aisle had closed his laptop entirely and sat staring out his window, lost in thought. It was the PA system that broke the silence again, but this time it wasn't Captain Reynolds. It was a voice Sarah didn't recognize, younger, uncertain in a way that suggested someone unaccustomed to speaking to crowds. Hello. This is Sergeant First Class Martinez. I'm the soldier who stood up earlier. Captain Reynolds asked if I'd be willing to say a few words, and I wanted to share something." There was a pause, the sound of a breath being drawn for courage. "I deployed to Afghanistan twice. Second tour, I was in Helmand Province, not far from where Lance Corporal Mitchell was killed. I didn't know him personally, but I knew guys from his unit. The Marines we worked with, they were the real deal. Professionals in every sense. They took the dangerous patrols, the risky missions, because that's what Marines do. They run toward the sound of gunfire while everyone else is running away." Sarah's hands stilled on her tray. She could picture this young sergeant, standing in the aisle somewhere behind her, probably holding a flight attendant's phone to make this announcement, probably terrified but doing it anyway, because it mattered. "What happened to Ms. Mitchell today?" Martinez continued, his voice growing stronger. "That can't happen. Not to Gold Star families, not to anyone. We ask these families to give us their sons and daughters, their brothers and sisters. We ask them to sacrifice in ways most Americans will never understand, and then we treat them like they're invisible, like their grief doesn't matter, like their loss is something we can ignore as long as we remember to post 'Thank you for your service' on Facebook once a year." He paused again. "I'm guilty of it too. I've walked past homeless veterans. I've ignored the mom at the grocery store wearing a Gold Star pin. I've been so wrapped up in my own life that I forgot to pay attention to the people who paid the real price for my service. But not anymore. Not after today. So, Ms. Mitchell, thank you. Thank you for reminding me what actually matters. And thank you for your son. We'll remember him." The PA clicked off. For a moment the cabin was silent. Then, from somewhere in economy, someone started clapping. It spread quickly, not the enthusiastic applause from before, but something slower, more solemn, a recognition rather than a celebration. Sarah turned her face to the window, letting tears slide down her cheeks unchecked. She was so tired of crying, so tired of being the symbol of sacrifice, the face of loss, the reminder of costs that most people preferred not to think about. She just wanted to be Sarah again. Just Sarah. Not Gold Star Sarah. Not tragic Sarah. Not the woman whose pain made other people feel uncomfortable and virtuous in equal measure. But James was gone, and this was who she was now. Forever. The applause faded. The flight settled into a new rhythm, quieter than before, more thoughtful. Sarah noticed passengers in the rows she could see, treating each other differently, offering help with overhead bags, sharing snacks, actually talking instead of retreating into devices. It was as if Captain Reynolds's announcement had reminded them they were humans traveling together, not just bodies occupying space. An hour into the flight, Patricia returned with Jennifer beside her. They carried something between them, a small cake with a single candle, the kind airlines usually reserved for honeymoon couples or milestone birthdays announced in advance. "We know tomorrow is Lance Corporal Mitchell's birthday," Patricia said quietly, kneeling in the aisle so she was at eye level with Sarah. "We thought maybe you'd want to celebrate it early, with witnesses, with people who know his name now and won't forget it." Sarah stared at the cake. It was simple, grocery store simple, probably something they'd grabbed during catering in Dallas. The frosting was white, with "Happy Birthday James" written in blue script. The single candle flickered in the recycled air. "We can't bring him back," Jennifer added, her voice thick with emotion. "We can't undo what happened or make any of this fair. But we can make sure he's remembered. We can make sure his birthday doesn't pass without being marked. If that's okay with you." Sarah couldn't speak. She nodded, and Patricia lit the candle with shaking hands. Then, impossibly, passengers around her began to sing. It started with the elderly couple in row 1, their voices thin but determined. The businessman across the aisle joined in, his bass surprisingly strong. Within seconds, the entire first-class cabin was singing "Happy Birthday" to a boy they'd never met, a Marine who'd died 3 years ago in a desert halfway around the world, a son who'd never hear these voices but whose mother heard them and felt something crack open in her chest. Sarah closed her eyes and made a wish, the same wish she'd made on every birthday candle since James died. That somehow, somewhere, he knew he was loved, that he understood his life had mattered, that he wasn't forgotten. She blew out the candle. The singing stopped. Someone in row 3 was openly sobbing. Patricia cut the cake with a plastic knife, serving pieces to Sarah and the passengers around her. It was too sweet, the frosting cheap, but Sarah ate every bite because James had loved cake, had always wanted the corner piece with extra frosting, had made the same terrible joke every birthday about saving a piece for later and then eating it before dinner. The businessman across the aisle raised his plastic cup of water. "To Lance Corporal James Mitchell," he said formally, "and to all the young men and women who gave everything so the rest of us could have everything. To James." Others echoed, raising their own cups. Sarah raised hers too, her hand trembling. "To my son," she whispered, "the best person I ever knew." They drank. They ate cake. And for a few minutes, at 35,000 feet over the American Southwest, a community formed around grief and gratitude, around the recognition that freedom wasn't free, and the bill came due in ways that shattered families and created holes in the world, shaped exactly like 19-year-old Marines who'd never get to grow old. As the cake service ended and passengers returned to their movies and books and thoughts, Sarah felt exhaustion wash over her. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation, the removal, the intervention, the announcements. All of it was draining away, leaving her hollowed out and heavy. She reclined her seat, pulled the thin airline blanket over herself, and closed her eyes. She must have dozed because she woke to Jennifer gently touching her shoulder. "Ms. Mitchell, we're starting our descent into San Diego. I need to bring your seat upright." Sarah blinked, disoriented. Through the window she could see the California coast, the Pacific Ocean stretching blue and endless to the horizon. They'd crossed the country while she slept. She was almost there, almost to James. The landing was smooth, Captain Reynolds greasing the wheels onto the runway with the skill of thousands of hours in cockpits. As they taxied toward the gate, his voice came over the PA one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Diego. Local time is 3:47 p.m. and the temperature is a beautiful 72 degrees. I want to thank you for flying with us today, and more importantly, I want to thank you for how you showed up for Ms. Mitchell, for how you honored her son's memory. That's who we should be as Americans, people who pay attention, who stand up, who remember. Ms. Mitchell, please take your time deplaning. There's no rush, and may your visit with your son bring you whatever peace is possible." The aircraft pulled into the gate. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers stood, gathered belongings, prepared to scatter to their individual lives and destinations. But before anyone moved toward the exit, Sergeant Martinez appeared at the front of first class, standing at attention in the aisle. "Present arms," he called out, his voice carrying military authority. Throughout the cabin, service members stood. Sarah counted at least 6 in uniform, and several others in civilian clothes, who clearly recognized the command. They raised their hands in salute, holding the position as Sarah gathered her backpack as she stood on shaky legs, as she stepped into the aisle. She walked through a corridor of salutes, through an honor guard formed spontaneously by strangers who understood what the gesture meant, who knew that some debts could never be fully repaid, but had to be acknowledged anyway. Each face she passed held something different: respect, sorrow, recognition, resolve. At the aircraft door, Captain Reynolds stood in his uniform, and he too was saluting, his hand crisp at his brow, his eyes meeting hers. "Fair winds and following seas, Ms. Mitchell," he said quietly, using the naval blessing that Marines had adopted as their own. "Your son would be proud of you." Sarah couldn't speak. She nodded once, then stepped off the aircraft and into the jetway, leaving behind the strangers who'd become witnesses, who'd become part of her story, whether any of them had planned it or not. San Diego was waiting. Fort Rosecrans was waiting. James was waiting. And for the first time since those casualty notification officers had knocked on her door, Sarah Mitchell believed she had the strength to face what came next. The rental car smelled like air freshener and anonymous lives. Sarah gripped the steering wheel as she followed GPS directions to Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery, her heart already beginning its familiar acceleration. The afternoon sun cast California gold through the windshield. Palm trees lined the boulevards. Tourists walked with beach bags and sunburned shoulders. The world continued turning, indifferent to grief, beautiful despite tragedy. She'd been here twice before, once for James's funeral, once on the first anniversary. Each time the drive felt like descending into a nightmare, but today was different. Today, she carried the memory of strangers singing happy birthday to her son, the image of Captain Reynolds standing in salute, the weight of being seen when she'd spent 3 years trying to be invisible. The cemetery occupied a promontory overlooking San Diego Bay and the Pacific beyond. 160 acres of white headstones in perfect rows, 48,000 graves holding those who'd answered when called. Sarah pulled through the open gate and navigated to Section P by heart. Row 12, Grave 487. She could have found it blind. She parked and sat for a moment, gathering courage. Through the windshield, she saw other visitors scattered throughout the cemetery, an elderly woman kneeling with flowers, a middle-aged couple hand in hand before a headstone, a young man in dress blues rendering a slow salute, each carrying their own impossible weight. Sarah pulled her backpack from the passenger seat and stepped into the golden afternoon. Ocean breeze carried salt and eucalyptus. Her feet knew the path, carrying her past rows of names and dates, past lives reduced to carved letters, past decades of American wars that blended into one long, continuous sacrifice. Then she was there. The white marble read, James Robert Mitchell, Lance Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps, Afghanistan, Purple Heart, March 15th, 2003, August 17th, 2022. Beloved son, forever our hero. Sarah knelt on grass, her knees finding familiar indentations. She pulled out the photo, James in dress blues, 19 and invincible, smiling that smile that had always made everything seem okay. "Hey, baby," she said softly, "happy early birthday. I'm a day early this year, but I had a feeling you wouldn't mind." She began telling him about the flight, about the man who tried to have her removed, the humiliation of that walk, the moment Captain Reynolds stepped out with a phone in his hand and everything changed. About the announcement, the sergeant who spoke, the cake and singing and corridor of salutes. "You would have liked Captain Reynolds," she said, tracing James's carved name. "He's a Marine too, former Harrier pilot, the kind who sees what needs doing and does it even when it's inconvenient. He reminded me of you that way." A shadow fell across the grave. Sarah looked up, startled. A man stood at respectful distance, older, maybe 65, wearing jeans and a Navy veteran's cap. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said, voice gravelly but kind. "I couldn't help overhearing. Are you talking about the flight from Dallas? The Gold Star Mother?" Sarah stiffened. "How do you know about that?" He pulled out his phone, showed her a video, shaky footage from inside an aircraft cabin. She saw herself in the aisle, saw Reynolds emerging from the cockpit, heard his announcement about James. "Posted 30 minutes ago. Already 50,000 views. It's everywhere," he said gently. "Twitter, Facebook, news sites picking it up. People calling it the pilot who made a stand. I recognize Fort Rosecrans in the announcement. And I volunteer here twice a week, so I thought maybe you could use some company." Sarah stared at the phone. 50,000 views. Her worst and best moment tangled together, now content for strangers. Part of her wanted to scream at the invasion, but another part, a part that sounded like James, whispered that maybe this was how his story stayed alive. "What's your name?" she asked. "Tom Brennan, Navy corpsman, Vietnam. I visit friends who didn't make it home. Been doing it 40 years. Sarah Mitchell. And this is my son, James." Tom removed his cap, held it over his heart. "Lance Corporal Mitchell, it's an honor." Sarah told him about James, the small moments that defined a life, learning to tie shoes at 4, crying at ET, calling from boot camp saying, "Mom, I'm becoming who I'm supposed to be." That last email ending with "love you to the moon and back." Tom listened, nodding occasionally. When she finished, he spoke quietly. "My best friend died in Vietnam, Michael Santos, 19 years old, died pulling wounded Marines to safety. I was the corpsman who tried to save him, and I couldn't. For 40 years I've been coming to his grave, apologizing. But you know what I realized? He didn't die so I could drown in guilt. He died so I could live. The best way to honor him was making sure people knew his story, making sure his sacrifice meant something beyond just his name on a wall." "How do you do that?" Sarah whispered. "How do you make it mean something?" "You do what you did today. You show up. You tell the truth. You let people see the cost isn't abstract. It's James Mitchell, 19, who'll never marry or have kids or grow old. It's you, carrying grief that would break most people. When someone like that pilot stands up, when strangers sing happy birthday, that's how it means something. That's how we keep them alive." Voices approached. Sarah turned to see people walking toward them. The elderly couple from first class, the businessman from across the aisle, and Sergeant Martinez in uniform with 2 other service members. "We hope we're not intruding," the elderly woman said. "We looked up the cemetery you mentioned, and we wanted to pay our respects." "You came here? From the airport?" Sarah stood, bewildered. "We live in San Diego," the businessman said. "We couldn't just go home and pretend today didn't happen. We needed to see where Lance Corporal Mitchell rests." Martinez stepped forward. "Ma'am, I called buddies stationed at Pendleton. We wanted to render proper honors if you'll allow it." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. The service members positioned themselves at the grave's foot. They came to attention in unison, raised hands in salute, held the position long enough for it to mean something. then dropped hands in perfect synchronization. The elderly woman placed white roses at the headstone. "Thank you for your service, Lance Corporal Mitchell. We won't forget you." One by one, others approached. The businessman left a small American flag. The Marine left his unit coin. The Army soldier left a challenge coin from deployment. Tom Brennan placed his faded Navy corpsman patch beside the others, from one who tried to save them to one who couldn't be saved. "Your mother honored you well, son." Sarah's phone buzzed. Texts from unknown numbers, messages from people who'd seen the video, comments from strangers. The video had 500,000 views now, news outlets requesting interviews. Someone had started a GoFundMe for Gold Star families. The story was spreading, rippling outward, touching lives in unpredictable ways. "It's too much," Sarah whispered. "I didn't want attention. I just wanted to visit my son." "I know," Martinez said gently, "but maybe that's exactly why this matters. You're not trying to be a symbol. You're just a mom who loved her son and got treated like a threat. That's real. That's something people understand. Maybe it'll make them think twice before judging the next person they see." The sun lowered, painting sky orange and pink, backlighting headstones until they glowed. Sarah looked at the gathering at her son's grave. Strangers who'd become witnesses, who'd traveled to honor a boy they'd never met, who'd chosen to let his story matter. She knelt again, placed her hand against warm marble. "I did it, baby. I made it here, and I brought friends. I think you'd be proud of what happened today. I think you'd say I finally stood up for myself, the way you always tried to teach me." Somewhere distant, a bugler played taps. The mournful notes drifted across the cemetery. That melody played at countless American gravesides, that sound that broke hearts no matter how many times you heard it. The group stood in silence as the final note faded. Then they began talking, sharing stories of service and loss, connections to the military, reasons for understanding why this day mattered. The businessman's brother died in Iraq. The elderly couple's son served 3 tours in Afghanistan and came home broken. Tom had 40 years of weekly visits. Martinez had lost squad members and carried their names tattooed over his heart. They were a community bound by sacrifice, by understanding that freedom's price was counted in graves like James's, in mothers like Sarah, in decades of grief that never fully healed, but could, maybe, be shared. As sky darkened, they said goodbyes. Each stopped at James's grave one final time, spoke private words, then squeezed Sarah's hand or hugged her gently. Martinez was last, handing her a card with his number. "If you ever need anything, you have a community now, whether you asked for it or not. We take care of our own, and Gold Star families are ours." Finally, Sarah was alone with James, with gathering darkness and distant waves. She sat with her back against his headstone, looking out over graves to the ocean beyond. "Tomorrow's your actual birthday. I'll come back then like always. But I wanted you to know about today first, that Captain Reynolds stood up for me, that strangers learned your name and promised to remember it, that your sacrifice is still rippling outward, still meaning something. You're not forgotten, baby. You'll never be forgotten." She checked her phone. 2 million views now. Thousands sharing their own stories. Veterans talking about invisible wounds. Gold Star families finding each other. Civilians admitting they'd never understood the cost until now. Someone created a hashtag. Remember their names. People posted photos of lost service members, telling their stories. James's face appeared in dozens of posts, his military photo shared with comments about honor and sacrifice. Some felt performative, people posting because it was trending, but some felt real, genuine expressions of gratitude and dawning understanding that freedom wasn't free, that every generation paid in blood. Sarah closed her phone and looked up at emerging stars. She thought about Captain Reynolds, probably home now, maybe watching the video go viral. About the man who tried to have her removed, wondering if he felt shame. about all the Gold Star families scattered across the country, carrying their own grief, surviving their own unsurvivable losses. "I love you, James," she whispered. "I'll love you until I stop breathing, and probably after that too." She stood slowly, kissed her fingers, pressed them against his carved name. She picked up her backpack, took one last look at the small memorial at his grave, and walked toward the parking lot. In the car, Sarah sat watching the cemetery in her rearview mirror. Tomorrow she would return. Tomorrow she would sing Happy Birthday properly. But today, something fundamental had shifted. Today she'd learned that invisibility wasn't safety, it was erasure. That being seen could be terrifying, but also liberating. That sometimes strangers showed up when you needed them most. She started the engine and pulled onto the road, carrying James in her heart the way she always would, but carrying something else too now. The knowledge that his story mattered, that her grief was witnessed, that one pilot's decision to make a phone call had reminded a plane load of strangers that heroes walk among us, that sacrifice deserves recognition, that we owe our Gold Star families more than we can ever repay. The California evening wrapped around her as she drove, and for the first time in 3 years, Sarah Mitchell believed she might actually survive this. Not because the pain was less, it would never be less, but because she'd learned she didn't have to carry it alone. If you've ever walked past someone without really seeing them, if you've ever made assumptions based on appearances, if you've ever had the chance to stand up for what's right and hesitated, remember Sarah Mitchell. Remember Lance Corporal James Mitchell. Remember that the person sitting next to you might be carrying an impossible weight. Remember that kindness costs nothing but means everything. Remember their names. Honor their sacrifice. And when you have the chance to do the right thing, even when it's inconvenient, be like Captain Reynolds. Make the call. Stand up, because that's what heroes do, and we need more heroes in this world.